He smiled like a man who had never been told no, and in that moment I felt small, invisible, like the floor beneath his shoes mattered more than my voice, yet my chest hurt in a quiet way, the kind that doesn't scream but stays, the kind that grows heavier when you swallow it. I was just a waitress to them, a woman in a black vest holding a bottle of wine, standing beside a table where powerful men leaned back in soft chairs, speaking about money like it was air. The room smelled of leather and confidence, and every man there believed the world bent for him, especially the one in the center, the boss everyone feared, the man whose smile made people nervous, whose name was never spoken loudly. I kept my eyes low because that's what people like me learned early. Keep your eyes down and your voice soft, survive by not being seen, but inside me something was already breaking, slowly, painfully, like a bone bending before it snaps. I had learned that silence could protect you, but I had also learned that silence could kill you piece by piece, and tonight, silence felt heavier than fear. The men laughed as papers were spread across the table, contracts filled with words they barely read, because men like him didn't need to read, they trusted their power to do the work, they trusted that everyone else would be too scared or too desperate to stop them. I poured wine with steady hands, though my heart was not steady at all, because I recognized the document, I recognized the structure, the phrasing, the careful cruelty hidden in polite language. Sadness washed through me first, deep and familiar, because I had seen this trap before, and it had already destroyed someone I loved. My brother had signed something like this, believing promises spoken with a smile, and 6 months later he was gone, crushed by debt that wasn't supposed to be his, erased by men who never touched him directly but ruined him anyway. I remembered his face when he realized the truth, the shame, the quiet apology in his eyes as if his suffering was somehow his fault. That memory sat in my chest as I stood there, listening to the boss speak, his voice smooth and amused, talking about opportunity, about loyalty, about how generous he was being. I felt helpless then, because who was I, really, to interrupt men like this, who had guards outside, lawyers on speed dial, police who looked the other way. My uniform felt tighter, my name badge suddenly ridiculous, and for a moment I told myself to stay quiet, to pour the wine, to walk away, to survive another night. But then I saw the clause, the same one, hidden deep, written to look harmless, designed to steal everything later, and something shifted inside me, not loud, not dramatic, just a thin thread of hope, quiet but stubborn. I told myself I didn't have to save the world, I didn't have to fight him, I just had to speak once, clearly, honestly, and accept whatever followed. Patience had taught me that timing matters, that power listens only when it chooses to, and so I waited, breathing slowly, letting the conversation flow, letting the boss enjoy his moment, letting the men nod and smile. When he finally lifted his glass and leaned back, satisfied, that was when I stepped forward, my voice calm, my hands steady, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might give me away. I said, "Excuse me, sir," softly at first, and the table went quiet, because people like him were not used to being interrupted by someone like me. He looked at me with mild irritation, like you look at a fly that hasn't yet earned a slap, and I continued before fear could stop me. I said, "Excuse me, sir, but this clause is a trap." The word trap landed heavier than I expected, the room seemed to freeze, and the boss's smile faded, slowly, carefully, like a mask being removed. He stared at me, measuring, deciding whether I was brave or stupid, whether I was a problem or entertainment. One of the men laughed nervously, another frowned, but the boss raised his hand, and silence returned instantly. He asked me what I meant, his voice still polite, still controlled, but colder now, sharper. I felt sadness again, because I knew what usually happened to people who spoke truth to power, but I also felt something else, something steadier, a quiet hope that maybe this time, just this once, the truth would matter. I pointed gently to the page, careful not to touch too much, and explained simply, calmly, using words I knew well, because I had studied law once, before life pushed me into uniforms and trays, before my future was traded for survival. I explained how the clause shifted liability, how it activated later, how it would ruin the signer without warning. No accusations, no drama, just facts. The boss listened, his eyes narrowing, his fingers tapping the table slowly. Helplessness crept back in when he smiled again, not kind, not amused, but dangerous, and he asked me where a waitress learned such things. I answered honestly, that I learned by watching my family fall apart, by reading at night when I was too angry to sleep, by surviving consequences meant for other people's greed. The room stayed quiet, and I realized then that this was no longer just about the contract, it was about control, about whether someone like me was allowed to speak at all. The boss leaned forward, his voice low, and told me I was bold, that boldness could be expensive, that I should return to my duties and forget what I thought I saw. Patience whispered inside me again, reminding me that justice rarely arrives loudly, that sometimes it begins with discomfort. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice, I simply met his eyes for the first time and said, "I understand, sir, but I couldn't forget it, and neither will they, because the clause is still there." That was when his smile disappeared completely, replaced by something darker, something calculating, and I knew that whatever happened next, my life had already changed. The air felt heavier after that, like the room itself was holding its breath, and I stepped back slowly, returning to my place near the wall, my face calm even though my hands were cold, because sadness had settled into something deeper now, a quiet ache that told me I might have crossed a line I couldn't step back from. The men at the table avoided looking at me, except for the boss, who watched me the way a hunter watches movement in tall grass, not angry yet, just alert. Conversation tried to resume, forced laughter, jokes that fell flat, but the confidence was cracked, and I could feel it even from where I stood. I told myself not to hope too much, because hope can hurt worse than fear when it fails, and I focused on breathing, on counting small details, the soft hum of the lamp, the weight of the tray, the rhythm of patience I had learned over years of swallowing unfairness. The boss finally spoke again, casually, asking his lawyer to read the clause out loud, slowly, and as the words filled the room, I watched faces change, not dramatically, but enough, a raised brow here, a tightening jaw there. Helplessness crept back in when the lawyer hesitated, then explained it away with smooth excuses, calling it standard language, harmless, misunderstood. The boss nodded as if satisfied, then looked at me again and asked if I was finished playing hero. I felt small at that moment, smaller than I had all night, because power has a way of shrinking truth when it doesn't like what it hears. I shook my head gently and said nothing, because patience told me that forcing the moment would break it, and silence, used carefully, can be stronger than shouting. Minutes passed, slow and uncomfortable, and then something unexpected happened. One of the men at the table, younger, less sure of himself, asked a question, just one, about what would happen if the clause was activated. The lawyer answered quickly, but not clearly enough, and the doubt spread like a stain you can't scrub out. The boss's expression tightened, not with anger yet, but with irritation, because doubt was not something he allowed in his world. He stood up suddenly, ending the meeting, saying they would review everything later, his voice calm but final. As the men gathered their papers, I felt the weight of what I had done press down on me again, sadness mixed with helplessness, because I knew review could mean anything, including making me disappear quietly. When the room emptied, I expected security to approach me, expected punishment to arrive swiftly, because that's how it usually works for people like me. Instead, the manager called me aside, whispering sharply that I had embarrassed an important guest, that I should apologize, that I should be grateful I still had a job. I nodded, because survival sometimes means agreeing even when your soul is tired, and I returned to work, carrying plates, refilling glasses, pretending nothing had happened while my mind raced through consequences. Hours passed, and the night thinned out, guests leaving one by one, until finally the boss returned alone, sitting at the same table, the contract still there, untouched. He motioned for me to come over, and every step felt heavier than the last, but I walked calmly, because fear had already done its worst and I was still standing. He didn't smile this time, didn't threaten me either, he simply asked why I cared. The question caught me off guard, because it wasn't cruel, it was curious, and I answered quietly, that I didn't care about him, I cared about what happens after men like him leave a room. He studied me for a long moment, then laughed softly, shaking his head, saying the world isn't fair and it never will be. I agreed with him, because that was true, but I added that sometimes unfairness depends on silence, and tonight I chose not to be silent. He leaned back, thoughtful now, tapping the contract again, and said patience was a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. I smiled faintly, not because I was brave, but because patience had been all I had left for years, and it hadn't broken me yet. He dismissed me with a wave, and as I walked away, I felt that thin thread of hope tighten just a little, not enough to celebrate, but enough to hold on, because something had shifted, not in the room, but in him, and powerful men rarely forgive being reminded that even they can be watched. The next days passed slowly, each shift feeling longer than the last, and sadness returned in waves, because nothing obvious happened, no apology, no punishment, no justice, just silence, and silence can be cruel when you're waiting for consequences. I kept my head down again, doing my work carefully, answering politely, pretending I was only what they saw, a waitress, forgettable, replaceable. Helplessness crept in during the quiet hours, when I wondered if I had imagined the impact of my words, if the clause would be signed anyway somewhere else, if speaking up had only made my own life harder. I told myself that justice doesn't rush, that patience means trusting the process even when you can't see it, but doubt is stubborn, and it whispered to me at night when I lay awake replaying that moment again and again. Then, one evening, the boss returned, not with his usual group, but with strangers, men in plain suits who didn't laugh loudly or show off power, men who watched and listened more than they spoke. I felt a quiet stir of hope then, small but real, because powerful people don't bring observers unless something matters. The meeting was tense from the start, voices low, papers shuffled, questions asked that weren't meant for show. I moved around the room silently, refilling glasses, catching fragments of conversation, words like risk, exposure, liability, and suddenly the contract wasn't a joke anymore, it was a problem. The boss's confidence was still there, but it was tighter now, controlled, like a hand gripping something that might slip. At one point he looked at me again, not with irritation this time, but with something closer to respect, or maybe caution, and that look told me more than words ever could. Patience held me steady, reminding me not to rush the feeling, not to assume victory where there was only movement. When the meeting ended, the men left quietly, and the boss stayed behind again, staring at the papers as if they had betrayed him. He didn't call me over, didn't threaten me, he simply folded the contract and placed it in his briefcase, carefully, deliberately, as if closing a door. That night, for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself a breath of hope, because injustice hates light, and light had reached this room. Days later, rumors spread through the staff, quiet whispers about deals falling apart, about partners backing out, about lawyers working overtime. I said nothing, because patience had taught me that watching is sometimes enough. Then came the day everything shifted. I was called into the manager's office, my heart heavy again, expecting bad news, but instead I was told the boss had requested me by name. My sadness flared, my helplessness tightened my chest, but beneath it all was that steady calm I had built over years of endurance. In the private room, the boss stood by the window, his back to me, the city stretching below like a reminder of how small individuals can be. He turned slowly and told me the clause was removed, the deal rewritten, cleaner, fairer, and that several people would no longer profit from it. He didn't thank me, men like him rarely do, but he said something else, something unexpected. He said I had cost him money, but saved him worse trouble later. Justice didn't arrive with apologies or praise, it arrived quietly, imperfectly, but real. He offered me compensation, money enough to change my life, and for a moment I felt the old sadness, because money can't undo what was already lost. I refused the amount, calmly, and asked instead for something simpler, a recommendation, a chance to leave the uniform behind. He studied me, surprised again, then nodded once. As I walked out, my steps felt lighter, not because the world had become fair, but because I had survived standing up to unfairness and hadn't been erased. Justice didn't roar that day, it whispered, but it was enough. I left that room quietly, just as I had entered everything in my life, without applause, without witnesses, carrying a calm that felt unfamiliar but earned, and sadness lingered, not sharp anymore, just soft, like an old scar reminding me of where I had been. The days that followed were strange, because nothing dramatic happened, no headlines, no revenge, no sudden miracles, just small changes that meant everything. My schedule shifted, my uniform felt temporary now, and the humiliation I once carried began to loosen its grip. Helplessness faded slowly, replaced by a steady sense that my life was no longer completely at the mercy of other people's decisions. The recommendation came through, simple but powerful, opening doors that had always been closed to someone like me. I started training at a legal office, quietly, anonymously, learning again, rebuilding what I had once lost, and Patience walked beside me every step of the way, reminding me that growth doesn't rush, it compounds. Months later, I heard that the rewritten deal had saved dozens of people from financial ruin, men who would never know my name, never know a waitress had stood between them and collapse, and that was fine, because justice doesn't need recognition to be real. One evening, as I passed the same hotel, now as a guest rather than staff, I saw the boss again across the lobby. He noticed me, hesitated, then nodded once, not as a ruler, not as a threat, but as a man who had been forced to adjust his path. His power was still there, but it had limits now, lines he knew existed because someone unexpected had pointed them out. I realized then that justice doesn't always punish the powerful, sometimes it simply restrains them, and sometimes that is enough. I sat alone later, watching the city lights, thinking of my brother, of the contract he never escaped, and for the first time I didn't feel guilt or anger, only a quiet promise that his story had not ended in silence. I had spoken when it mattered, not loudly, not perfectly, but truthfully, and that truth had moved something solid. The world remained unfair, arrogant men still smiled too easily, but I was no longer invisible to myself, and that was the justice I hadn't known I needed.